Get that man out of my house. Nobody moved, not the caterer by the door, not the estate attorney who had driven 2 hours from Hartford, not the three cousins who had flown in from Atlanta and were now holding their champagne glasses very still, like they were afraid the sound of bubbles might make things worse. Nobody moved because the man who had just spoken, the one pointing at the housekeeper's son like he was something that had crawled in from outside, was Reginald Ashworth. And when Reginald Ashworth pointed at something, people had learned over 61 years of watching him that the correct response was to be somewhere else. But the housekeeper's son didn't move either. His name was Calvin Osei, 26 years old. He worked the lunch shift at a breakfast diner on Route 9 and drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked rear bumper that he kept meaning to fix. He was wearing his good shirt, the navy one his mother had ironed that morning, because she had told him this was important, that today was important, that he needed to look respectable when he came to pay his respects. He had not planned on saying anything at all. But then he had seen what was in the glass. Reginald Ashworth had made his money the slow way. Not inheritance, not a lucky startup, not a lawsuit that paid out more than anyone expected. He had started with one dry cleaning shop in New Haven in 1987 and had turned it into 43 locations across Connecticut and Massachusetts before he sold the chain in 2019 for more than most people earn in 100 lifetimes. He was 61. He had been married once, to a woman named Dorothy who died of a stroke when their son was 11, and he had not remarried because he did not see the point of replacing something irreplaceable. He had built things instead. He had given things to his community. He had endowed a scholarship at the high school where he had graduated 43rd in his class. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good man. He was also, by any reasonable measure, completely blind to what was happening in his own home. His son's name was Tobias, 33 years old, soft-spoken in the way that some people mistake for gentle when it is actually just careful. Tobias had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and a grief he had never fully metabolized, because when you lose your mother at 11, you don't really process it so much as you build a room around it and learn not to open the door. He had met a woman named Corinne at a fundraiser 18 months ago. She had been wearing a green dress. She had laughed at something he said that wasn't even particularly funny, and he had thought, there it is. He had proposed 4 months later. He had not asked his father first. That was the first thing. Not because he didn't respect his father, but because he was 33 and he'd been living alone for 8 years, and he was tired of asking permission for things he had already decided. Reginald had met Corinne exactly twice before the engagement was announced. Both times she'd been polished and appropriate and had said the right things about his work and the scholarship fund. Both times she had touched Tobias's arm in that particular way that said, "This one is mine." Reginald had smiled. He had shaken her hand. He had told his son he was happy for him. He was not happy for him. He didn't know why. That was the honest truth of it. He could not have told you with any precision what made the back of his neck feel tight every time Corinne's name came up. She was beautiful and educated, and she worked in hospital administration, and she had never done anything, not one single thing, that he could point to and say, there, that is the thing. So he said nothing, because Reginald Ashworth had not built 43 dry cleaning locations by leading with his feelings. The reading of the estate plan had been his attorney's idea, not a will. Reginald was 61 and healthy, not dying, but a formal review of how the assets were structured. Now that Tobias was getting married, and things would need to be updated, his attorney, a dry man from Hartford named Gelb, had suggested they do it properly, with the family present, so there would be no questions later about what anyone had known and when. Reginald had turned it into a small gathering, because that was what he did. He did not do quiet paperwork. He did not do things halfway. He had called his brother and his 2 cousins and his son's college roommate, who was the closest thing Tobias had to a best friend, and he had had Mabel come in to cook. Mabel Osei, who had been cleaning the Ashworth house every Saturday for 14 years, and who made a sweet potato pie that had once made a grown man cry at a church potluck. Mabel had brought Calvin because she always brought Calvin on big days. He helped carry things. He helped set up. He moved quietly and did not speak unless spoken to, and Reginald liked that about him, had always liked it, in the vague, unexamined way that people like things they never have to think about. Corinne had arrived with Tobias at 11 in the morning. She was wearing cream-colored linen and small gold earrings, and she had kissed Reginald on the cheek and said the house looked beautiful. She had helped Mabel arrange the flowers on the dining table. She had laughed at something Reginald's brother said. She had been, as always, completely and immaculately appropriate. At some point in the early afternoon, while Gelb was going through the asset summary, and everyone had moved from the living room to the dining room, and there were drinks being poured, Calvin had gone to get more ice from the kitchen. He'd taken the long way back. Not because he was nosy. He would want you to understand that. He had taken the long way because the bathroom near the kitchen was occupied and he needed to put the ice down for a second and stretch his back, and the sitting room off the hallway was empty and quiet. He had set the ice bucket on the side table near the window, and that was when he had seen Corinne's bag. It was open, just barely. The clasp had not caught, or she had not bothered because she had probably left it in here for 30 seconds while she was doing something else, and had not expected anyone to walk through. He would not have looked at all except that something had slid half out, a small amber prescription bottle, and the name on the label was not Corinne's name. It was Reginald Ashworth's name. Calvin stood very still for a moment. He was 26. He had not been to college. He worked the lunch shift at a diner. He knew, in the ordinary way that anyone knows things, that people sometimes carry other people's medication for them. Elderly relatives, people who needed help. It was possible. It was completely possible. He picked up the bottle. He read the label. He read it again. Then he stood there for a little longer, and he thought about all the reasons this was fine, all the reasons there was an explanation, all the reasons he should put it down and go back to the kitchen and not say anything, because who was he really? Who was he to walk into a room full of people who had more money in their checking accounts than he would earn in the next decade and say anything at all? He thought about Reginald Ashworth, who had once, just once, 3 years ago, asked Calvin how his night classes were going, in a tone that suggested he actually wanted to know. He put the bottle in his pocket. He went back into the dining room. He had not planned to say it at the table. He had planned to find a quiet moment, pull Tobias aside, show him the bottle, let the adults handle it. But there was no quiet moment. The reading had started. Gelb was talking. Corinne was sitting next to Tobias with her hand over his on the table, and Calvin was standing near the sideboard with the ice that nobody needed anymore, looking at her, and she looked up, just for a second, and their eyes met. She knew. He could see it. Not guilt, exactly. Something colder than guilt. An assessment. A recalculation. The look of someone who has been managing a situation for a long time and has just identified a new variable. Calvin said quietly, "Mr. Ashworth." The room didn't stop. Gelb kept talking. Nobody looked up. He said it again, louder. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm sorry. I need to say something." That time, the room stopped. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds, Reginald said 5 things. He said, "Calvin," just the name, a warning. He said, "This is not the time." He said, "This is a private family matter." He said, "Young man, I think you should wait outside." And then, when Calvin had placed the bottle on the table, gently, carefully, right in front of Gelb's paperwork, and said the name on the label was Reginald Ashworth's, and the pills inside were not what the label said they were, Reginald said the last thing, "Get that man out of my house." Calvin was still in the doorway when Mabel came from the kitchen. She had heard her son's voice doing something it had never done in this house, rising, insisting, not backing down, and she had come fast, wiping her hands on her apron, and she stopped when she saw the table, the bottle, everyone's faces, her son standing in the middle of it. She said, "Calvin, what happened?" It wasn't a question. It was the voice of a mother who has spent 14 years in someone else's house, being careful and quiet and invisible, asking the one question she needed answered before she decided what to do next. "The pills in her bag," Calvin said. "They're not what the bottle says. Mom, they're not his heart medication. I've seen those. They're in the cabinet by the sink every Saturday. These are different." "You went through my bag," Corinne said. Her voice was steady. That was the thing that would stay with people in that room for years, how steady her voice was. "The bag was open," Calvin said. "The bottle was half out. The label has Mr. Ashworth's name on it." "Because I was going to give them to him after lunch," Corinne said. "His doctor changed the prescription last week. Tobias asked me to pick them up." She looked at Tobias. "Baby, you asked me to pick them up." Tobias looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "Tobias," she said again. Soft. Patient. The voice of someone who has had a lot of practice at patience. Tobias said, "I don't remember asking you to do that." The silence that followed that sentence was a particular kind of silence. The kind that happens when something true has been said in a room full of people who were not expecting it. Reginald was still standing. His hand was on the back of his chair. He was looking at the bottle on the table, and then he was looking at Corinne and whatever he had been pushing down for 18 months, whatever it was that had made the back of his neck tight every time her name came up, was very close to the surface now. "Tobias," he said, slowly, "you didn't ask her to pick up a new prescription." "No," Tobias said, "I didn't. I didn't even know your prescription changed." "It didn't," Reginald said. Another silence. "Corinne," Gelb said. And Gelb was the kind of man who had been a lawyer for 31 years and had seen a number of things that had seemed impossible right up until they happened. "Whose prescription is this? Who is the prescribing physician?" Corinne stood up. She was still composed. She was still, and this was the part that Calvin would think about for a long time afterward, still working, still managing, still looking for the angle. "I think," she said, "this has gone far enough. I'm not going to sit here and be accused by—" she looked at Calvin, "by someone who had no business touching anything in that room." "My name's on the bottle," Reginald said. "Reginald, my name's on the bottle, and my doctor didn't call me, and I didn't ask Tobias to get anything, and that bottle is not the right shape for my heart medication." He picked it up. He turned it over. He said very quietly, "What is this?" What it was took 3 more days to fully understand. The county medical examiner's toxicology consultant, because Gelb had called someone before Corinne's car had even left the driveway. Because Gelb was 31 years of being a lawyer, identified the pills as containing a compound that in the correct formulation was used for one thing and in the incorrect formulation was used for something else entirely. Something that, in an older man with a real heart condition, administered slowly over time in place of his actual medication, would produce symptoms that looked very much like natural cardiac decline. The prescribing physician's name on the label was real. The physician himself had no memory of writing it. His prescription pad, his office confirmed, had gone missing 6 weeks ago. Corinne Adler had met Tobias Ashworth at a fundraiser 18 months ago. She had been wearing a green dress. She had a way of laughing at things that were not particularly funny. She had also, the investigation would later find, been in significant personal debt. She had also been, for 8 months prior to meeting Tobias, employed at the same hospital network where Reginald Ashworth's cardiologist practiced. She had also, it turned out, done this before. Not exactly this. Not pills in a bag, but something adjacent. Something that had ended with a civil settlement in another state under a name that Tobias would have found in 11 minutes of searching if he had thought to look. He had not thought to look. Because she had a way of laughing at things that were not particularly funny, and when you are 33 and you have been lonely for a long time and someone looks at you like you are worth looking at, you do not always think to look back. Reginald Ashworth was not a man who cried easily. He had cried twice that he could remember, when Dorothy died and once as a child, over something he no longer recalled. He did not cry when Geld told him what the toxicologist had found. He sat in his study with the door closed, and he was very quiet for a long time. And then he came out and he asked Mabel to make coffee. She made it. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. They had sat at this table many times over 14 years. Not often and not for long, and always with the particular kind of careful distance that the situation required. But she sat down now, and she poured 2 cups, and she did not say anything, because she had spent a long time in other people's houses, and she knew when a person did not need words. "Your son," Reginald said after a while. "Yes," Mabel said. "How old is he now?" 26. Reginald nodded. He looked at his coffee. "I told him to get out of my house." "You did," Mabel said. "In front of everyone." "Yes." He was quiet again. "He didn't leave?" "No," she said. "He didn't." Calvin had not left because he did not know where to go. That was the honest answer. His car was parked on the street, and his phone had 12% battery, and everything had happened very fast. And he was standing in the doorway of Reginald Ashworth's dining room, and he did not know if he had done the right thing or just an enormous, irreversible thing. And those are not always the same. Tobias had found him there about 10 minutes after Corinne left. He didn't say anything right away. He stood next to Calvin, and they both looked at the dining room, which was empty now. Gelb and his paperwork, and the cousins and the brother, all having relocated to the study for a conversation that Calvin understood he was not part of. "She was going to give those to my father at lunch," Tobias said. "Not an accusation. Just saying it out loud, testing the shape of it." "I know," Calvin said. "He takes his medication with lunch. Every day. I've watched him do it since I was a kid." "I know." Tobias looked at him. "Why did you take the bottle out of the room? Why didn't you just leave it?" Calvin thought about how to answer that. He thought about what he could say that was true and also made sense. He said, "I don't know. I just kept thinking, what if I don't, and then something happens, and I knew." Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." It was such a small sentence. 2 words. It didn't cover anything, really. Didn't cover the scene at the table, or the cousins who would be talking about this for years, or the fact that Tobias was going to have to call someone and tell them the engagement was off, or the larger, harder thing, which was sitting with the knowledge of how thoroughly he had not seen it coming. It didn't cover any of that. But it was what there was. Reginald Ashworth called Calvin 2 weeks later. Not to his house, by phone on a Tuesday evening, while Calvin was on his break at the diner. He asked how the night classes were going. Calvin said he had finished his associate's degree in May and was looking at programs for the fall, business administration, maybe, or healthcare management. Reginald said that sounded right. He said there was a board seat opening at the Scholarship Foundation in the spring, a junior seat, advisory only, for someone who understood how far a small amount of institutional support could go at exactly the right moment. He said he didn't know if that was something Calvin would be interested in. Calvin said he would think about it. He didn't say yes right away. He wanted you to know that. He didn't jump at it, didn't treat it like a reward, didn't feel like the story had tied itself into a neat bow, because neat bows are not how actual things work. He thought about it for a week. He talked to his mother. He thought about what it would mean to sit in a room with people who would look at him the way everyone in that dining room had looked at him, and whether he could do that without shrinking, and whether he wanted to. He decided he did. The toxicology report was finalized in September. The prescribing physician's stolen pad was entered into evidence. The civil record from the other state was entered into evidence. Corinne Adler entered a plea in November, in a Hartford courthouse, in a navy blazer and small gold earrings, still composed, still managing, still looking for the angle, right up until the moment the judge said what the sentence was, and it became, finally, undeniable that there was no angle left. Tobias did not attend the hearing. He had moved back into his father's house for the summer. Not permanently, they both understood, just for a while, and on the day of the hearing he drove to the cemetery in Hamden, where Dorothy was buried, and sat for an hour, and did not tell anyone where he had been. He didn't have to. His father was 61 and not stupid, and had spent 33 years being this particular boy's father, which meant he knew the shape of his son's grief better than he knew most things. He said nothing when Tobias came home. He heated up the leftover food Mabel had sent, and he put it on the table, and he sat down. They ate together. There is a version of this story where the moral is simple, where it is about greed and justice and the satisfaction of watching a calculated person's calculations finally run out. That version is not wrong. The greed was real. The justice happened. The calculations did run out. But there is also this. Calvin Osei spent 3 years carrying the fact of that afternoon inside him, the particular weight of having spoken up in a room where speaking up was the least expected thing, and having been told to leave and having stayed anyway. Not heroically, not dramatically, just because he had picked up a bottle and read a label and understood that some information, once you have it, cannot be returned to the shelf. He joined the foundation board in March. The first meeting was in a conference room in downtown New Haven, on the 14th floor, and the elevator opened onto a lobby with a marble floor and a view of the harbor. He walked in wearing his good suit. Not the navy shirt, a suit, because his mother had told him this was important, that this was important, and he had learned to listen to her on such things. The chair of the board was an older woman who taught contract law at Yale, and who shook his hand with the kind of grip that expected something back. She said, "We've heard about you." He said, "Good things, I hope." She smiled. Not a polite smile, an actual one. "We'll see," she said. He sat down at the table. He opened his notebook. He was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, and the only one who had driven a 2009 Civic to get there. And those facts were true, and they would probably always be true in some version of the rooms he would walk into from here. He had stopped waiting to feel like he belonged. The thallium had been in the pills, but the real poison, the one that nearly worked, the one that came closer than anyone wanted to admit, was the assumption that a man in a borrowed shirt, parking on the street, moving quietly through someone else's house, couldn't possibly know something worth knowing. That assumption had a very long shelf life. Calvin Osei intended to outlast it. I keep coming back to the moment Calvin put that bottle on the table. Not the arrest, not the plea, not the courtroom in Hartford with Corinne still composed in her navy blazer, still looking for the angle. I keep coming back to that one quiet motion. A 26-year-old man in his good shirt setting a prescription bottle down in front of people who had already decided, without saying it out loud, that he had nothing worth hearing. He could have walked past it. He almost did. And I think about that a lot, how close the whole thing came to going the other way. How thin the line is between the moment you pick something up and the moment you put it back down and tell yourself it's not your business. What Calvin did wasn't complicated. That's what people miss when they talk about courage like it's a grand gesture. He read a label. He recognized something was wrong, and then, when every signal in that room told him to be quiet and invisible, he chose not to be. That's it. That's the whole thing, but doing the right thing clearly, in a room full of people who don't want you to. That's harder than it sounds, and most people never find out if they're capable of it, because they never let themselves get to the moment of decision. There's a cause and effect to this story that I think matters. Corinne didn't fail because she was unlucky. She failed because the plan she built depended entirely on everyone around her, staying in the role she'd assigned them. The wealthy father who wouldn't look too closely, the grieving son who needed to believe in something. The housekeeper's child who would stay in the kitchen. The moment Calvin stepped outside that role, the whole architecture came apart. That's what happens when you build something on other people's silence. One person decides to speak, and it's over. And Reginald. I don't want to be too easy on him because he spent 18 months with a tight feeling in the back of his neck and chose not to examine it. He knew something. Not what, not exactly, but something. And he overrode it because looking would have required him to admit he'd been wrong to trust. And that is a hard thing to admit when you've built your life on good judgment. The willingness to look anyway, to stay honest with yourself, even when it costs you something, That's not a minor thing. It's actually the most important kind of intelligence there is. What I carry from this story is something about what it means to know something and act on it anyway. Calvin had no status, no authority, no reason to believe anyone would listen. He spoke up because the alternative, staying quiet and watching something happen that he could have stopped, was worse than being wrong. That calculation, made in a split second in someone else's hallway, is what I'd call real character. Not the kind you perform when people are watching, the kind that shows up when you're alone with a bottle in your hand and nobody would ever know. He didn't leave when he was told to. That's the part I keep returning to. He stayed.